Welcome back. Good morning and thank you for staying with KTN News. You're watching Morning Prime, but we're talking about matters education. And in studio, I'm still joined by Andiwo Bondo, who's an education and policy expert, and via way of Zoom from Kisumu County, Charles Ochome, who's the chair of the Kenya Private Schools Association. Just focusing on today's discussion, all to do with the 100% transition policy that is being implemented by the current government. A lot to talk about in terms of the successes, but equally various challenges have been highlighted so far. And right before the break, we were speaking to Ochome, and he highlighted some of his issues to do with the 100% transition, especially when it comes to capitation matters. Private secondary schools, just to inform our viewers, don't get any money in terms of the students going to their institutions. But get this, each student in a public secondary school in Kenya receives a capitation grant of 22,244 shillings per year from the government of Kenya, disbursed to school operations and tuition bank accounts in an equal installment of 25% per quarter of the fiscal year. So would this be the much needed cure in terms of the population issues we're facing? Should private secondary schools perhaps be considered?
Yeah, thank you very much, Rogers. I think I want to first and foremost agree with Bano Chome on the fact that because of this new policy, congestion is real now in our secondary schools. And this has also led to a lot of overload in terms of work for teachers, leading to less interaction between learners and the teachers themselves. But I don't think considering private schools for capitation grant will be a silver bullet to be able to solve this problem. I would think that there are three other steps that government should take first before we move to looking at funding private schools. One, let government create enough space in public schools for the current enrollees, those who are already in the public schools. Can we be able to create enough space in terms of classrooms, enough space in terms of boarding facilities, enough space in terms of laboratories and libraries? And then we also need to improve those conditions, because some schools may be having facilities, but the conditions are deplorable, making some schools look like concentration camps. And if you look, actually, some recent assessments attribute the recent fires to school conditions. So that to me should be a priority. Then we need to look at the teacher numbers. We need to increase the number of teachers. So if the government is able to do the three, create enough space, improve school conditions, employ more teachers, then I think we could be able to have a discussion at the fourth level of how to support private schools to be able to help decongest. But again, the challenge that maybe we would be posing to Bwana Ochome and his colleagues, would they maintain the same level of fees? Or they would be also, it's a give and take, should be give and take, because government should be able to first and foremost, and we agree that the children in private schools are not private children, but governments have a responsibility to support public facilities and support public programs. So in the event that they choose to do like they did with the universities, then there must be a negotiation. Will they be able to accept cuts in fees so that if they get 22,000 from government, they may maybe reduce their fees from maybe 100 to 53 at the same level of public. So this is something that needs to be negotiated. It's not just a straight jacket that we admit, because what will they be giving back if the government was to respond, saying we can be able to?
Perhaps you can pose that challenge to Ochome and his ilk. Ochome, how would you respond to that?
Thank you, Mr. Bond. I think that's a very good question. One that one like me would love to hear. You see, we are Kenyans, and what we are saying is every school has their school fee maximums and minimums that they charge. So what we are saying is the child pays that fee. So if the government pays that fees to the child, it means that fees comes down with what the government has paid. What I'm saying, I've seen working in Britain. You know, in Britain, if a parent pays for school fees in a private school, this is the part the government pays. So it is not the money being given to fund private money given to the students to reduce the load on their parents. That's what we are asking for. Actually, private schools are not asking the government to fund them. That's a misstatement. We are asking the government to give all Kenyan students school fees which if it is 22,500 for all of them, so wherever they are going, if that school is charging 80,000, then it is less that one. That's what we are, and that motivates the parents. That what we are saying. I hope that answers your that to boost our us in our.
Okay. Okay, Bwana Ochome, I think your point is definitely across. We're having some issues with your connection, but we'll definitely get you back on the line. Even as we continue with the discussion, perhaps let's take a look at what Shadrach Miti had to say during an interview with the Kenya Secondary School Heads Association chairperson Kahi Indimuli on this same issue, the 100% transition and the congestion nightmare in public secondary schools. Let's listen in.
Majority of our schools, from data available, many of the children, about 70%, will be in the sub-county schools. These sub-county schools have space, but they are also lacking infrastructure. They would be able to take a bigger percentage of students. Therefore, it means government must invest in the improvement of infrastructure across the board so that parents have confidence that the schools that are in the sub-county are just as good. We've seen from past results they are also doing well. But we need to invest there, increase their infrastructure, give them enough teachers, then send more students there. This at the moment is not happening. Therefore, the strain that is there is this 30% schools, extra county schools and national schools. They are the ones that are feeling the biggest strain on their facilities, because parents would want to take their children to top national schools, top extra county schools, and some of the county schools. These are the schools that are now, if you called principals and asked, they'll tell you if it was a river, it would say it has burst its banks and water would be killing people. These schools have now children that are more than the capacity they have. A school which had a capacity of 400 today has 600 students. Look at the distribution of secondary schools vis-a-vis primary schools. In areas like Nairobi City, some of the cities that we have, they have more primary schools than secondary schools. This is because they have more private investors in primary schools than secondary schools. So they churn out more children who require secondary space, but those counties, those towns, those cities do not have secondary schools to accommodate them. Now, this causes strain to the neighboring. For example, Nairobi, you'll find many children from primary schools in Nairobi are in Kiambu region, Murang'a, Machakos, Kajiado, you know. So they are offloading their children to those counties. Those counties too have children generated from their own primary schools. Yeah? So you find that becomes strenuous to many schools around some of these major cities that we have. So a few schools are facing tremendous strain on their facilities, mainly boarding schools. And somebody has made parents in the country believe that boarding schools is where quality education is offered. So everybody wants to take their children to boarding schools. So they are strained, they don't have enough boarding facilities, Therefore, there is congestion. Then you come to classrooms, they are not enough. There is congestion. In my view, there is need for very good mapping of schools and primary schools, very seriously. And then with the current situation, identifying schools that perennially face strain on their facilities because of their nature. They are good schools, they are performing well. How can government mitigate in ensuring that these schools have enough facilities to be able to continue taking in more students?
Okay, interesting sentiments right there from Bwana Ndimuli. Of course, speaking for secondary public schools in the country, perhaps you can start with your reaction to that, Andiwo, because he paints a realistic picture, perhaps of the population pressure in some counties, including Nairobi, who have their own set of children who are living, you know, public primary schools set to join public secondary schools. They offload that population pressure into the neighboring counties, you know, and it brings up the issue of the boarding facilities in the secondary schools. What say you? It seems he's pointing to the same issue about infrastructure.
I think I agree with Mwalimu. Is point on in terms of where the problem is. The biggest problem is in infrastructure, in terms of how we can be able to, I think the call that now we need to make clearly and strongly to government is to increase the infrastructure fund and make sure that this time around, I agree with Mwalimu Ndimuli, that we need to focus, because I think for some time the focus has been largely on national schools and extra county. But now we need to focus at the bottom of the pyramid, where we have the larger numbers. I think sub-county schools account for more than or close to 70%, as he says, of our school, secondary school system. So we need to do that. Then the issue of teachers is also a must, because you cannot be able to increase number of learners, but you're not talking about increasing the number of teachers to be in tandem. You see, the other thing that we also need to point out, the 10,000 classrooms that is being touted around is actually targeting the 2023 double transition, the double intake. We are not building 10,000 classrooms for the 100% policy. So my call would be, we actually need a similar number targeted or tied to this policy to be able to address the current congestion. Because if we get to 2023 with the current status or conditions, the 10,000 will not help, because we are going to have almost a crisis in terms of numbers of schools. The other thing that we also need to point out, you know, finally in Kenya, we would prefer, middle-class Kenyans would prefer to take their children to private schools in primary. But when it gets to secondary, everybody rushes back to public national, public extra county. You see this, it is now, the pyramid gets skewed again. So it means there's real pressure from public primary schools, pressure from private schools, children that are now actually aiming to get back. And majority of them, almost over 90% of those in private schools, get back to public secondary schools. So you see that kind of pressure can be very high.
Yeah, definitely.
Then I think what now we want to say in the process, we need to look at how we focus more. It is cheaper to focus more on day schools. I agree with Mwalimu that we have, I think, around 20,000 primary schools in Kenya against under 5,000 secondary schools. And if we focused more on day schools, you know, you'll be doing laboratories, you'll be doing classrooms, and you can be able to do libraries without focusing on boarding facilities. I think that is maybe what we need to call, apart from improving classrooms in the existing schools, we also need to have a program to build new schools.
Okay, well noted. Ochome, give us your take in terms of the reaction and what Bwana Ndimuli said. And you were quite categorical in terms of training teachers. It's not just 10,000 schools that need to be built, but training teachers in terms of achieving that global ratio of 40:1. Well, what's your take on that equally?
Yeah, the government need to start training teachers for us to be safe even as a country, because in classrooms we can be having schools. There still be a problem. So the things that needs to be done must be looked into very soberly. And as we look at, we must leave biases that bring us down as a people. One of the biases, Kenyans are very hardworking people, but they are also not united sometimes in looking at this in a sober way. For example, I agree with the speaker, Mr. Bondo, and even Kai about government in most schools, but I don't see it as a solution, because if you look at the rate people are bringing children into this world, I think it is going to be faster than building those classrooms. The government will not have money. Let ourselves to just build schools, equip them, and do all those things, because it has a responsibility of providing other facilities like health security and all those things, food security. All these things requires money, and therefore, if we are going to assume that the government will provide all these facilities, we'll be cheating ourselves, and we'll have a problem for a very long time. The world over, people are going public-private partnership. Private schools can ease up the pressures in education, and I think it has worked very well in private primary schools. So we need to ask ourselves as Kenyans, if it has worked well in the primary schools, why is it not working well in secondary schools? The reason is simple. The government thinks, Kenyans think that the government should be the sole provider of education at high, and this is going to be a problem for a very long. We need private investors to ease up the matter of these high schools so that the government can have a break and be able to do other programs in the country. If good private schools come up, parents will like them. South African parents choose high schools that are private as opposed to government because they have believed in them. One problem that we have in the country that I do not want to put under the carpet is the cost of providing that education. Private schools and academies, they are those which you find even in deathbed schools, which are not government, in the slums. There are those that medium class can attend. There are those that upper class can attend. Those are just like you go to a plane, you choose which seat you want to use according to your strength. So we should be able to be sober and allow the government to provide capitation to all children, so that these schools that are coming up in the rural setups can be able to stand. And I believe that will help us in not building so many classrooms. That money can be used to other things, because we have empty classrooms of high schools close to those government schools. And because the government has taken all the children, you remember this 100% transition, it was based that all children must go to public schools, and that must be checked. And I believe the government is listening. They need to come out clearly and say the parents who want their children to go to other schools should be allowed. The condition that they would have used in public school is given, so that we move as a country. That's my take on that congression. We build classrooms. Others can be built even if they are not by the government, by the private sector, and I think that is happening. And we just need the goodwill to be able to facilitate and fast track that. Thank you.
Okay, well noted, Bwana Chair. Ochome right there joining us from Kisumu. So as we conclude on this particular discussion, Andiwo, he's definitely pushed on that point of capitation, and he seems to, hold the idea that perhaps it's worked at the primary level, why not at the secondary level? And the capitation issue is definitely a sore sight for those in the public and private sector. They don't seem to see eye to eye. But what do you think is best moving forward? Because I know earlier on you listed a couple of 3 issues before we need to tackle, before we talk about sharing capitation with private secondary schools as we conclude.
Yes, I think first and foremost, I would think that we need to review education sector investment policy, so that we are able also to create conducive environment for those who want to invest in private schools. I think that is the first step that Bwana Ochome and his team should be looking at. They should be able to be given incentives from government in terms of either tax rebates or maybe some packages that would allow somebody to invest very easily in a private school in any part of the county, particularly where we have less of private schools, and that would be one. Number two, I would still go back to my point that the government should be able to make sure that we have enough spaces in secondary schools, focusing in public secondary schools first, focusing on sub-county schools, and I think we might want to encourage government to pay attention more to day schools. Then government should be able to create new spaces and improve conditions in the new and the old. New in terms of new schools, and then look at teacher. The teacher issue is a very big one. There's one thing that we also did not mention, Rogers. It has also strained teaching learning resources, like the textbook teacher, the textbook pupil ratio has been affected drastically. We were actually moving towards one to one. But I think now we lost it because of this policy. We need to get back and see how do we increase also supply of teaching and learning resources, particularly curricular materials.
As we finalize, just briefly, do we need to relook at the placement in terms of the students who are transiting from primary to secondary? Should secondary schools be included perhaps as it is in the university level?
At the university level?
As it is in the university level, you know, once you graduate from high school, you know, you can be placed in a private university, you know?
Yeah, I think that is something we can consider. But my take is that that is something that we can consider, but it needs to be discussed so that if government will be paying the usual 22,000, that's capitation, what would be, because I don't think we would just say if a private school charges 200,000, the government, even if the government still pays and the parents would want to take children there, maybe we may not sustain children in schools for 3 or 4 years. So they may also be able to look at what is it that they can be able to do in return. Say reduce the fees a little bit and do this, but at least to me the minimum we look at creating more spaces, improving conditions, employing more teachers, and then now we can discuss the issue of giving private schools. It's not a bad idea, but it needs to be discussed, and both parties need to at least give and take in some way.
Multi-sectoral level discussions. Scratch my back, I scratch you, sort of thing. But anyway, just to inform our viewers, since 2013, the government has recruited an additional 107,208 teachers, 54 to primary school and 52,000 to secondary school level. Many thanks for your contribution, gentlemen. Right here in studio is joined by Andiwo Obondo, who's an education and policy expert. We appreciate your input in terms of the 100% transition and some of the issues that need to be looked at. Equally joined virtually by Charles Ochome, who's the chair of the Kenya Private Schools Association. All the best in your tenure as you lead that particular association, but equally, asante for your input right here, joining us from Kisumu County virtually. And that brings us to the end of Education Matters in terms of the discussion we were having. So, good, clean bill